Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christophe Courchaine, Interim Director of the Environmental Law Center, Director of the Environmental Advocacy Clinic, and an Associate Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. We're very pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. Each of these talks in the Hot Topics series is worth one Vermont CLE credit. So please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have time at the end of the presentation today for some Q&A. To participate in that, if you're watching on VLGS YouTube Live, you may enter your questions in the chat space at any time, and we will get through as many as we can. So don't hold them back. We'll get them, and we'll be able to discuss them with our presenter. And today, we are pleased to welcome as our presenter, Grace Hussein. Grace covers farming, agricultural policy, and solutions as a staff writer for Sentient. Her reporting has been published in Truthdig and the Good Men Project, and she's been featured on BBC Weekend Edition. She holds her MS in Animals and Public Policy from Tufts University. Grace is joining us this summer at VLGS as one of our summer Animal Law Media Fellows. Today, her presentation will cover engaging communities for solutions to CAFOs. So please join me in welcoming Grace Hussein.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I do have a slide deck, so I'm just going to go ahead and share that now. Okay, are you able to confirm whether or not you can see that for me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so as Christophe just said, my name is Grace Hussein, and I am a staff writer journalist for Sentient. As an outlet, we focus very heavily on farmed animal issues, as well as the fallout of factory farms and the impacts that factory farms and CAFOs have on communities and the environment and the world at large. Today, I'm going to be talking about community solutions to industrial animal agriculture, and we're going to be taking a look at a few different ways that communities are responding to some of the problems that they're facing. I do want to flag that my email is here on the slide, so if anybody watching now or in the future has pitches or has anything that they'd like to reach out about, please do feel free. So before I get into a little bit more of an introduction about myself, I do want to go ahead and go over the plan that we have for today. So I'm going to be starting with talking about a little bit more about what solutions are, what makes a really great solution, and then why community involved and community engaged solutions are so important. From there, we're going to be tackling the question of how communities are actually responding to the problem of industrial animal agriculture and the problems that it causes. We're going to be looking at that through case studies or a few examples from the work that I've done engaging with communities that are responding to these issues. We're going to be starting off in Sampson County, North Carolina, where the community is working together with a statewide nonprofit, Clean Air North Carolina, to implement air quality monitoring. From there, we're going to go ahead and jump over to Slaughter-Free Milwaukee, where through a very traditional grassroots rapid response campaign, the community members were able to prevent a slaughterhouse from entering and being constructed in a majority Black community neighborhood there. And then we'll be wrapping things up by visiting South Dakota and the Oglala Lakota buffalo herd out there that is doing a lot of work to address long-held and long-term injustices faced by the Oglala Lakota Nation. And then, as Christophe shared, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so please be sharing those. That I have plenty to talk about during that time. So, a bit more about me. I am a writer, journalist, and then also solutions correspondent for Sentient. And on top of that, and my current fellowship with the Vermont Law and Graduate School, I'm also a climate fellow for the Solutions Journalism Network. So as you might imagine, I do a lot of work on these solutions, and these solutions can come from a very wide array of different stakeholders. So for example, I've reported on everything from a company that's trying to use artificial intelligence to address and to reduce the suffering of fish at slaughter, to currently I'm writing an article about a nonprofit out of Colorado that's trying to help workers transition out of working in slaughterhouses and into other areas and other jobs in the community. When I am writing about these solutions, though, it's important to know that I'm not writing about them as a feel-good journalist just to write something that we can all be happy about and that's a great outcome, and to celebrate these solutions. I'm actually taking the journalistic framework of solutions journalism and applying it to these. And that basically means that I'm taking a really in-depth look at what's happening. I'm looking at the response itself. I'm looking at insights for how other places might be able to replicate that response. I'm looking at evidence of how the response worked or how it didn't work, depending on how things went. And then I'm also looking at some limitations and barriers that response might face moving forward. So you'll see later on when we're talking about the examples that I'll be providing, that some of that will be coming through as well, and you might be able to identify some of that. However, though, like I said, my solutions reporting covers and touches upon a lot of different areas. My specific interest is in these community solutions because when you're on the ground and you're speaking to people about the problems that they're facing and then how they're solving those problems, they're especially and specifically empowering for people, and that just strikes a chord with me. So moving right along, what makes a great solution? We come up with solutions as individuals in our lives on a daily basis, everything from what's happening at work and how do we solve complicated issues, to what are we going to have for dinner and what is going to create the greatest buy-in, and what do we have the resources to accomplish. However, not every solution is a great one. I'm sure that we've all had moments where we fail to come up with great solutions and things go wrong. So I turned to ChatGPT and I asked for their ideas to what makes a great solution. And they came back with 5 pillars. The first is that a solution has to be effective in order to be great. It has to actually address the problem that it was designed for. And then it has to be efficient. It has to use the resources that you have in a efficient and effective manner. It needs to be feasible, so it has to be practical and realistic. And then it also has to be simple enough to avoid causing any unintended errors or to avoid overcomplication and thus reduce adoption. And then ideally, a solution should also be scalable so that it grows with the need as well. So then why are community engaged solutions important? As community engagement is the one pillar that I argue ChatGPT missed. And why are these solutions important? It's simple. It's because solutions are not one size fits all. What works in one place is unlikely to work in another place simply because the people in one place are not like they are somewhere else. And so when you're engaging with community members, you're likely to find that communities know why there's a problem and what the problem is. They know what needs to be done to address that problem. They know who you need to talk to in order to address that problem. And they know ultimately what the solutions and how that problem should be addressed. So again, on the efficacy front, community-led solutions can be more effective because people know their communities. They're intimately familiar with the problem at hand. They know what tactics are the most effective at building buy-in. They know who would be effective coalition members and who are key stakeholders. So on this point, a community that is deeply religious, you may need to speak to religious leaders in order to create broader buy-in, whereas a more secular community, you might have different community leaders that you need to speak to in order to really craft and come up with a workable solution for that community. And then finally, community members know how to solve the problems caused by industrial agriculture. If you're looking at industrial animal agriculture causes a lot of problems for communities. It is a major polluter. It can cause job issues, it can cause income issues, it can cause food issues. So what in that group of problems are the ones that are actually causing issues for that community, and what is it that they need addressed? However, perhaps one of the most important facets of why community engaged solutions are important is because oftentimes the communities coming up with these solutions on their own are marginalized communities, be they majority people of color, poor communities, disabled communities. It has been the case for a long time that their problems, the unique problems that they face, have been ignored, or that the people have been ignored when solutions are being crafted. So consider, for example, food stamps. Food stamps is overwhelmingly a very positive solution to the problem of food insecurity. However, if you're just going to be giving food stamps to people who are living in a food desert, then that doesn't actually increase their access to food. It gives them the money to buy food, but if there's no food that they have access to, then they're not able to secure that necessary resource. So that's just one example of how turning to community members and actually talking about the issues that they face can come up with stronger and better solutions. In short, going back to ChatGPT, community members know how to craft solutions that are effective, efficient, feasible, simple, and often scalable, and that are unique to the makeup and the problems that their communities face. So on that note, we can jump right into the interesting part. And here we're going to be briefly looking over 3 of the stories that I've covered. We're going to be starting in order to make the case that the solutions that communities come up with are often very different and highly applicable to that community, but it may not necessarily be able to be spread across communities because, again, these community members are coming up with solutions that factor in and address their specific needs. So we're going to be starting out by looking at that partnership with a larger nonprofit in North Carolina, and then we'll be moving on to evaluating a traditional grassroots campaign and how activists in Milwaukee were able to do that. And then we'll wrap things up by looking at the Oglala buffalo herd. So here we have a picture of one of the more than 400 CAFOs currently in operation in Sampson County, North Carolina. So of those 400, most of them are raising pigs. And just so that we're all on the same page, these concentrated animal feeding operations, assuming they have pigs over 55 pounds, that means that each one of these 400 operations has more than 2,500 swine on their facility annually for at least 45 days. It's part of the reason why they've come to be called factory farms in a lot of animal advocacy spaces. Those hogs are confined to the barns that you see, those 4 barns lined up there, and then all of their waste and manure gets filtered out into that retention pond, where it's held before being sprayed on nearby fields as fertilizer. The pond behind the barns is an open-air cesspit and is a significant source of air pollution. As that slurry and waste of water sits prior to being sprayed on those fields, it pollutes the air and exposes nearby communities to dangerous chemicals. This isn't the only way that this slurry makes its way into the air. In doing my reporting on this topic specifically, I spoke to individuals and I heard stories of this spray being done next to playgrounds where children were playing or next to homes where elderly people lived. So between the cesspits and the chemical spray, this is a significant issue for the people of Sampson County, North Carolina. In fact, a study that came out in 2023 that analyzed a nearby county's air quality found that residents of that county are subjected to higher levels of air pollution than the state's residents as a whole. Among the chemicals that they're exposed to is ammonia, which at unsafe levels can cause respiratory and eye issues. Of course, these cesspits are also connected to chemicals like methane, as well as phosphorus and nitrogen that come with their own sets of problems. So despite the heavy presence of animal agriculture, the county lacks federal air quality monitoring. Instead, policy decisions are made based on data collected from federal monitors located in communities miles away. The community is specifically pushing to get federal monitoring because it's important, because if federally operated air monitors flag unsafe levels of a pollutant in the air, then the government is obligated to take action. Of course, it comes as no surprise to anyone here that most of Sampson County's residents are either poor or people of color or both. So again, we're seeing this community being an environmental justice issue, where this community that has historically had less socioeconomic power is being impacted by a lack of government and policy action. So what are community members doing about it? Well, they've created a partnership with Clean Air North Carolina, which is a nonprofit that has had some success with programs in other parts of the state. And their goal is to bring about some federal air quality monitoring in Sampson County. And how they're doing that is by deploying 30 sensors to homes across the county and providing trainings for community members on everything from how to interpret the data they collect through those sensors to advocacy techniques. They're also collecting data through an app and a mobile monitoring system that when a community member say they smell ammonia or are experiencing something unusual in the air quality, they can report that into the app, and then that mobile monitoring system will be deployed in order to go collect some data and see what might be going on. So the goal behind all of this is to really equip these community members with the tools and the knowledge that they need in order to take that data and take that expertise and take what they've learned to advocate for themselves and to argue for policymakers that they need an actual federal air quality monitoring system in their community. So again, this is a great example of a partnership between a nonprofit that has expertise in the areas of policy advocacy and environmental science with the expertise of the community members, who know what they need. And we're starting to have questions about the impacts that these CAFOs were having on their health. So the idea is that by starting with the local unofficial air quality monitoring, the community will be able to leverage the data that they collect to lobby for an official federal monitoring program. It's an approach that, like I said, has already been successful in some other areas in North Carolina, including Charlotte, where the residents have actually gone on to successfully advocate for other environmental initiatives, such as more green spaces and electrical vehicle charging stations in their communities. However, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, no solution is without its limitations. And what we've seen in Charlotte is that as these green spaces and as these environmental improvements take hold, they're actually contributing to the gentrification that is already happening in that neighborhood, as largely Black neighbors who have been living in that neighborhood in Charlotte for generations are being pushed out due to increasing cost of living and just broadly gentrification, which their initiative is unfortunately contributing to. Still, again, this is an excellent example of an existing nonprofit organization working with community members to combine their two wells of expertise behind a shared goal. So now we're going to go ahead and move things over to Milwaukee, where the residents were able to keep a slaughterhouse from coming to their community. The slaughterhouse would have been focused on veal and lambs, which is why we have the picture of the calf here. Now called Slaughter Free Milwaukee, the initiative started as a grassroots response to a proposed slaughterhouse. It has since been absorbed, that group of individuals have since been absorbed as a chapter into the national organization Slaughter Free Network, which has the goal of creating a slaughter-free food system. For years, the city's policymakers had struggled to attract businesses to the Century City area. And so when Strauss Meats suggested that they relocate their operations from Franklin, a suburb of Milwaukee, to the Century City area and the Century City Business Park, policymakers were enthused. They were completely on board. The slaughterhouse would have brought, had it been approved and been constructed, it would have brought about 250 jobs to the area, paying an average of about $17 an hour. However, part of the problem for community members was that these are not the types of jobs that they want to brought into their community. The nature of the jobs is that slaughterhouse work is rough. Slaughterhouse work has been linked to higher rates of depression and anxiety in workers. Workers are often develop PTSD from their time working in slaughterhouses, not just due to the nature of the job where they're killing and dismembering animals, but also due to how these workers are often treated. If you recall back during COVID, there was a lot of coverage surrounding the treatment of slaughterhouse workers. Specifically, some of the most disturbing stories surrounded managers who would actually bet on which workers would fall sick. In other work that I've done, workers have spoken about how they've had to wear diapers because they're not getting breaks, or how they pretend to be religious in a way that they're not, simply because under religious protection laws, they have to have breaks to pray. And then they would use those breaks in order to go to the restroom or take care of other needs instead of actually praying. I've also been told stories of workers taking up drugs or alcohol in order to handle the stress of the job, or in order to stay focused long enough, in the case of certain drugs, stay focused long enough in order to get the job done. In addition, women often miscarry due to the work conditions, not just due to the stress, but also due to some of the bacteria that they are exposed to while working in a slaughterhouse. So I've heard several stories of women actually miscarrying pregnancies that they did want to carry to term due to their employment in a slaughterhouse and the conditions that they endure. One worker who I spoke to, who's currently employed in a slaughterhouse, summed it up perfectly by simply saying that workers in slaughterhouses don't have dignity, and that it is not a dignified job. So given all of this, it's easy to understand why slaughterhouses are not a nice place to work, and why the community's members did not want to bring a slaughterhouse into their community. Combine that with, of course, the environmental impacts of slaughterhouses. You have a lot of water and noise pollution. A lot of the times when slaughterhouses move in, the property value of nearby properties drop. So again, it's really not hard to fathom why residents didn't want to bring a slaughterhouse into where they live. Despite that, in their eagerness, the local council failed to engage with their constituents to see whether they wanted the slaughterhouse in the neighborhood. According to the local activists, the answer was a resounding no, but still, early community hearings were empty, with no constituents showing up either in support of or against the project. the representatives from Strauss Meats still assured the council members that the community was fully on board, despite their lack of presence there in those early hearings. In another strange turn of events, the city's Department of City Development failed to brief the policymakers on the impacts of the proposed development prior to the hearing. While that's not a requirement in Milwaukee that the department do that, it is customary, and the council members noted that for every other piece of development legislation, they were getting these briefings and these reports, but this one didn't receive that. So it wasn't until after those initial public hearings that the local activists actually got wind of the proposition. And then what did they do about it? They campaigned. So obviously these activists, they weren't pleased, but they had only about a week to organize before the proposal was supposed to come up before the full city council and be voted upon to move forward or not. And instead of going and picketing outside of the existing Strauss Meats facility and outside of Milwaukee and Franklin, they focused on engaging with the people who live in Century City and that neighborhood, including at a local cafe, where the activists went and they talked to their neighbors, and what they found is that almost everyone they talked to had two things in common. First, they hadn't heard that the slaughterhouse was proposed and that it was slated to be moving into the neighborhood. And second, they weren't in favor of its construction. In addition to having these conversations where they were really making sure that their neighbors were aware of what was happening, as well as getting their feedback, they also organized an email campaign in which dozens of people emailed the city councilmen to express their concerns. When the city council meeting actually rolled around, they had also filled the viewing gallery, holding signs that expressed their discontent with the slaughterhouse. In the end, their efforts were successful. Strauss Meats pulled their proposal due to the community's unrest surrounding the development, and thus the slaughterhouse fell through. Of note, a couple months ago, Strauss Meats actually pulled out of Milwaukee completely, closing down their veal and lamb operations, and instead moved to Illinois in order to increase and expand their beef and beef slaughter operations that they have going on out there. However, back to Milwaukee, the community organizing that happened there represents a pretty classic example of grassroots activism, but I brought it up and I bring it into this presentation because it also serves as a perfect example of how poorly things can go when a solution doesn't center the community. In an attempt to bring jobs and development to an area that has long been economically disadvantaged and is again a pretty poor area, the council members were on the verge of approving a slaughterhouse that the community simply didn't want, and which likely would have had negative outcomes for that community. So from there, we're going to go ahead and move on to the Olalla Lakota buffalo herd. And this is actually one of my favorite stories that I've written while at Sentient. And in order to fully understand the context of what's going on here, or at least begin to understand the context of what's going on here, it's important to first look at the history of buffalo in the United States. And yes, I am using the term buffalo in my discussions with Bam Brewer, who stewards the buffalo herd. It's the term that he uses, and in honoring that relationship, it's the term that I will be using as well. So during the 1800s, buffalo were hunted to near extinction. People would hang off of train cars and shoot buffalo for fun. And part of that was to clear the plains and make space for the cattle that colonizers were bringing in, to have more grazing land and to be able to take over that space. But it was also to further oppress the indigenous communities who for generations had followed the buffalo herds across the land and relied upon them heavily for food and for their livelihood. So if you destroy the buffalo populations, then it becomes easier to control the indigenous communities that relied upon them. So following the buffalo herds being decimated, the Oglala Lakota tribe now has just one small corner of South Dakota that they call home, as they were forced to settle down on land that was difficult to cultivate, and after the bison herds, the buffalo herds were decimated. And instead of relying upon the buffalo for a lot of their nutritional needs and livelihoods, the US government started to introduce beef, and that era has long lasting impacts to today, as the Pine Ridge Reservation that the Oglala Lakota tribe calls home is currently one of the most impoverished zip codes in the country, with many of the people in the reservation living in food deserts. Of the few grocery stores that are on the reservation, they tend to feature very high prices and have very limited amounts of fresh foods and produce. And the produce that they do have tends to be of very poor quality. The situation is so dire that many members who are able to afford, of the tribe and residents who are able to afford it, will actually leave the reservation and drive hours away to grocery stores off the reservation in order to do their grocery shopping at a more well-stocked store with better options. The situation on the Pine Ridge Reservation and the lack of access to fresh food, combined with the storied history of colonialism, is also having very real impacts on health outcomes within the community. So on the Pine Ridge Reservation, we have extremely high levels of diabetes and heart health issues, as well as some of the lowest life expectancies in the country. Enter Bam Brewer and his bison herd. So Bam Brewer saw the problems that his community and his family were experiencing, and he got his first 25 bison from the National Park Service. Since then, he's paid them back. He's paid back for the bison to the National Park Service, and he's almost tripled the size of his herd. Now he has about 70 animals. And according to him, these animals are playing a pivotal cultural and nutritional role in his community. When he looks at his own family, he's very proud of the fact that he's been able to raise his own children eating buffalo meat instead of beef. And it was a very important moment for him when at a local cookout, his children did try beef and they were not impressed. They asked to go back to eating the buffalo. So for him, that was a very important cultural, very important healing moment of that represents being able to bring his family back to some of the foods that they traditionally would have consumed. So for Bam Brewer and for the rest of the Oglala Lakota Nation, bison have historically played a very important cultural and spiritual role as well. They view them as family members and friends, and not just animals. So despite that, Brewer had originally transported a bison to a cattle slaughterhouse off the reservation when he was starting to slaughter these animals for food. But because of the way that he thinks about his animals and he regards his animals, he wasn't comfortable with the facility and its methods. Again, he cares for them as friends and family members and places a lot of spiritual significance on the buffalo. And so when he got to the facility and he saw the bolt guns and the stress and the fear that was so evident in these animals, he knew he wouldn't be able to do this again. Instead, with the help of a nonprofit organization called One Spirit, Brewer has built a processing facility on the reservation. And while only a small portion of that meat is sold, most of it is given to community members to help combat that food insecurity while reintroducing a traditional protein source. Interestingly, though, that processing facility, no animals are slaughtered there. Instead, the bison are killed in the field. So just to give you a little bit of information on how that happens, on the day of the hunt, it's deeply ritualistic. The prayer and the ritual starts well before the hunter actually goes out into the field. And they believe that through that prayer and through that ritual, the bison actually knows and volunteers that they're going to die that day. And they volunteer to be that animal to feed and to take care of their family members, the hunter. So once the hunter has fired the arrow or the gun that will kill the bison, they continue to pray and thank the buffalo for their sacrifice. And then as the buffalo takes its last breath, the hunter feels the spirit of that buffalo leave the animal, and then the spirit will almost look back at the hunter and offer to take any messages back to that hunter's ancestors as the buffalo passes into the spiritual world and into the afterlife. As a final step in the ritual process, the final step of the ritual is that the hunter will actually eat the bison's liver covered in its bile as a form of purification, because, as we know, the liver purifies, is a purifying organ. It purifies the blood of the animal. And so Van Brewer believes that by eating that organ, he's being purified from what he's just had to do. So again, the buffalo herd on the Pine Ridge Reservation is a great example of really combating some of these long-term oppressions that the Oglala Lakota Nation has endured, and that they're really taking, Van Brewer's really taking his culture and taking a very specific and very culturally important step in order to start combating some of those issues and problems faced by his community. So suffice that to say that the moral of the story here, and if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's just that individuals in communities are inventive and they're smart, and they can often come up with solutions that work the best for them. And if we engage with these communities and we talk to these community members, oftentimes the best solution is among them. And so taking that time can really impact the efficacy and the ability to move forward and come to positive solutions. So that's the conclusion. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Grace, for a series of very interesting stories of community-led solutions. A reminder that if you have questions for Grace, the VLGS Live YouTube channel on the right-hand side of the page is ready for your questions. And we'll be taking those as we go forward. My question for you, Grace, to start us off, to kick us off here, one of the interesting challenges in community-led efforts is that they are time intensive, and they can be pretty costly for marginalized communities to fully sort of participate in the processes that are in place where these solutions can be presented and, if there's a legal context, codified, enacted, or a project defeated in a regulatory process, for example. So how have you seen that play out as you look at these sort of heroic community-led efforts that are very commonly in our American environmental law system uncompensated, or I should say regulatory system, very uncompensated advocacy by community members? Whereas on the other side of the fence sometimes, or the industrial agriculture side in this case, there's there's more money than one can imagine to sort of navigate those regulatory processes and do lobbying and even do AstroTurf organizing. So how have you seen that play out where there's this disparity of resources?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So in my reporting, I focus a lot on the community efforts themselves. And one way that communities access resources is by partnering with larger organizations that do have a lot more resources. So we saw that with Clean Air North Carolina, in Sampson County. In Sampson County, this organization, Clean Air North Carolina, that does have those resources in order to lobby, and obviously nothing that we're doing when it comes to environmental justice, none of the resources that we have, whether you're talking about environmental justice or animal advocacy, is going to come close to what Big Meat has, or what some of these more moneyed interests have. But I think that a lot of the times when we're looking at some of these failed solutions, they come from entities, whether it's a nonprofit organization or policymakers, that almost take on a paternalistic view of the communities that they're supposed to be serving. And in so doing, they're deciding the solutions that should be applied there instead of actually listening to the community members and what they need. So I really think that the resources question comes down to the entities with resources making it a priority to support the communities, and instead of prioritizing issues like accepting that they might need to spend a little bit more money in getting that community buy-in and potentially cut something somewhere else. Because again, from my experience, these solutions are by far more effective when you actually have the communities bought in. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, I think that it's very often that the resources available for this advocacy isn't centering the community preferences and solutions, and it's following a template that's determined elsewhere. I do have a couple questions for you that have come in. One question is, I love the idea of sharing solutions instead of just reporting the problems. Do you have any statistics on if other organizations that have similar issues have used these solutions as a template, or is there sort of a database of solutions that you're aware of in any of these respects that are covered in your talk?
Yeah, so a really good resource if you're looking for solutions, well, is obviously the Solutions Journalism Network. If you're looking at it from a journalistic perspective, they actually have a database of a lot of different solutions. It's non-exhaustive, but a database of a lot of different solutions, reporting and solutions articles. And then another resource would be Project Drawdown, which is it's not journalism, but it is basically taking solutions or potential solutions to issues across the board, including a lot of environmental and food systems issues as well. So again, that's the Solutions Journalism Network for journalistic solutions, and then Project Drawdown for like academic and solutions that have yet to be reported on at length.
They're great resources. Another question from Professor Delcy Winders here at Vermont Law and Graduate School, the head of our Animal Law and Policy Institute. Her question: how do we ensure that the interests of the animals that are at issue here are not subsumed by the interests of humans in those communities? To be sure, the interests of humans and animals are often aligned insofar as both are exploited and harmed by CAFOs and slaughterhouses and other forms of industrial agriculture. But they're not always completely aligned. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on ensuring we consider the animals in the mix.
Absolutely. I appreciate that you noted that oftentimes interests align, right? Like within the animal protection movement, there has been a trend toward recognizing the similarities and the connections between animal advocacy and other forms and more traditional social justice advocacy. And I think that focusing on those areas is important moving forward. However, there are going to be times when animals are not the center. Animals potentially are being harmed. So, for example, in the Oglala Lakota bison solution that I shared, ultimately those bison are being slaughtered. They're not living out their full natural lifespan. But also, how are those animals being benefited? They're living a natural life on land that they should have been on for generations, that they've been reintroduced to now. They're being cared for in a way that is by far better, I would argue, than how cattle are cared for. They are living longer lives, even if it's not the full lifespan. So I think that there's still a long ways to go as far as making sure that we are coming to solutions that engage and work out for all stakeholders, animals included. But by focusing on how we can work together, we're more likely to come to workable solutions that more people can get behind, that we can have a broader coalition to get behind, and then work from there.
And I love that idea of animals as stakeholders in these issues. Another comment from our your colleague media fellow Hoda. The question is really about how you approach community members and leaders on covering stories from a solutions-based perspective. Maybe a little bit of the journalism, you know, tips and tricks that you're engaged in with this, you know, with many issues in the environmental justice and you know, marginalized community space. Very important question about methodology and you know, sort of approach.
Yeah, so in my journalism, one thing I really try to do is I try to be very respectful and protective over my sources. So part of that is being very open with them up front. So I tell them right off the bat, this is the framework that I'm going to be using. Some of my sources want to have a very lengthy explanation about what solutions journalism is. Some people are happy just to know a very brief understanding of it, but it's really, again, listening to them and what they're asking of me and doing my best to be respectful of that and protective of them, because a lot of my reporting does deal with historically marginalized communities. And as a journalist going into these communities, same with a lot of people coming up with the solutions, a lot of journalists historically have not treated these communities with much agency or respected their agency. So that's not something that I ever want to contribute to. And it is something that obviously I'm still learning and still growing in as a journalist, but it's really just being upfront with the sources about what a solutions framework is. And most of the time they're really excited to talk about that, even if it is what barriers have you faced and how might someone else do it better? Because ultimately, I think a lot of these sources want to see their solutions potentially being adapted to fit somewhere else, or want to inspire other people to make change in their own communities.
Maybe a quick follow-up to that one. As you approach folks who are, you know, promoting solutions, they've often lived through, I think of the Sampson County example, just a massive amount of trauma in their communities. And, you know, I'm wondering sort of how that plays out as you try to shift the discussion to the future, and if there are ways you navigate that.
Yeah, so in my interviews, I use an adapted version of I guess source-led questioning. So when I'm talking to the source, if they I make clear to them that they don't have to talk about anything that they're not comfortable talking about. And then I try to focus in, especially in solutions reporting, I try to focus in on the areas that they think are the most important, while also getting the information that I need in order to construct the story. Because oftentimes, again, I'm relying that they know their community, they know the problems that they're facing, and they know what's most important. And so I really do lean into that quite heavily. And then it all goes back to being respectful of them. So if they are talking about something that is traumatic, potentially breaking it up in a couple different shorter interviews in order to make it easier, or maybe somebody prefers doing one very long interview, or potentially allowing them to bring somebody else or have a support system within that interview, so it's not just them talking to me. And I think that all of those sort of tactics is, again, just talking to the source and doing my best to make sure that they are getting what they need. And in my experience, once people start talking about these things and once people start feeling like they're being heard, they're excited to talk about even some fairly traumatic situations and things that have happened.
Maybe I'll ask this question also from Professor Winders. Perhaps another aspect of solutions that your framework may, omitted, but you also talked about earlier, was sort of avoiding unintended consequences, like the gentrification you described in Charlotte. Do you have thoughts on how those types of consequences can be avoided or mitigated as we start off down these paths of real community improvement? If we think about it in that context, community improvement often has a gentrification consequence. I think there's probably many other sort of unintended consequences that sort of purported solutions may entail that need to be thought through carefully. Do you have any thoughts on that aspect of it? How can we avoid those consequences?
Absolutely. So a community generated solution is not always, but often in partnership. In the case of the North Carolina example in Sampson County, it's a partnership between Clean Air North Carolina, organization that has expertise and resources, and then it has in the community. So when we're implementing these solutions, I think that it's also important to consider those as experts in policy and as experts in what the fallout of these issues might be, so that we can also be thinking about those things, preparing the community members for those things, and then take that into account and make sure that they're aware that that might happen, and what the fallout might be based upon our experience doing advocacy elsewhere, so that then they can make informed decisions for their communities. Because ultimately, it's about making an informed decision. So in the case of Clean Air North Carolina, they told the community, this is what we might expect, this is what's happened in Charlotte, and the community still decided to move forward, and that's something that they wanted to do. So it's really about giving the community and making sure that the communities are informed so that they can make decisions that work for them. And whether we're expecting gentrification or expecting that down the road, that's something that they can factor in, and then we can support their decision.
I have sort of one, I think, final question for you, Grace. As you look out at the landscape of journalism from your vantage point, this style of reporting, or this framework for approaching stories, is, I think, somewhat unusual, and it sort of has the curse of good news, which is not as commonly read and distributed and clickable and all those sorts of things. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to expand the reach of this type of storytelling, so that it, reaches as many people as possible, and as many communities that are thinking about how to address problems in their own backyards, and looking for models, especially since, there's been some absolutely wonderful environmental justice reporting over the last several decades, and especially in the last five years or so, that has really shown a light on major injustices. But there's often not the focus on solutions at the end of that reporting. It certainly is illuminating, but it doesn't necessarily bring us to how is that community taking agency over that issue and moving forward. And so, as you think about journalism and some of its current challenges, how do you think about your own work in that context?
Yeah, so solutions journalism is actually based on surveys. I don't have the exact numbers, I can get them to you later, but they're actually, people want to read about solutions. They want to have that context, and people are getting tired basically of avoiding the news because it's just going to depress them, and they're not going to want to dial in to CNN if all they're hearing is about how awful the world is. So solutions is a really great way of attracting readers back to journalism, and it's something that if you look into the Solutions Journalism Network, they have all the data, but that is actually attracting readership back to online or print media, and even radio media and news media as well. So really, solutions journalism is taking journalism by storm right now. Maybe that's just because I'm so into this and this is my little world. But we're seeing more and more outlets turn towards solutions journalism to bring back their readership. And I think that, well, just to preempt the question about whether or not this is just feel-good fluff reporting, I'd want to go ahead and re-emphasize that we are taking a very deep dive into these solutions to actually take a look at not just how they're working well, but how they haven't worked so well. So there are facets of solutions journalism to cover topics such as greenwashing, but by using this framework, you're able to really critically analyze those issues instead of just reporting on how awful the world is. I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, Grace, that is encouraging. Well, sort of, that makes me hopeful that there is an increasing audience for this type of work. It's very important, and yes, it strikes me as so needed in this discussion about industrial agriculture and other real environmental justice issues around the country, especially in the context of what we think about here at the law school a lot, which is the judicial hostility to considering environmental justice issues in various contexts. These solutions, cumulative solutions, seem like a very powerful curative and direction for students to think about as they're pursuing their own advocacy journeys as well. So I think we're out of time at the moment. Maybe before I let you go, Grace, can you repeat your email? We did have a question in the chat asking for you to repeat your email.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really simple. It's just Grace, GRACE, at sentientmedia.org. That's SENTIENT media.org.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Grace, for what was a very interesting presentation, and for your for joining us this summer as a fellow, as a media fellow. We're really grateful to have you here, and it's been a pleasure to host you. Thanks again to our viewers for joining us today. And our next talk in this Hot Topic series will be on Tuesday at the same time, the same place, and we will be entering our last week of the VLGS summer term. And so we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much. Have a good day, everyone.